I gave my parents $2,500 a month, but they lied about being sick and went on vacation with my sister. Growing up, I always knew my younger sister Melanie was a favorite. It wasn't even a question. If she sneezed in the right direction, our parents acted like she discovered electricity. Meanwhile, I had to practically move mountains just to get a nod of approval. It started small. Melanie got the bigger bedroom because she was delicate. She got out of chores because she was too busy with school, which really meant binge-watching reality TV. Every school project she half-finished was framed and displayed in the living room like some kind of shrine. Me? Straight A's didn't matter. If I came home with a 98 on a test, my dad would ask where the other 2 points went. If I scored a winning goal at a soccer game, my mom would tell me to stay humble. When Melanie got picked as the most friendly in middle school, they treated it like she had been knighted by the Queen of England. By high school, the favoritism was impossible to ignore. When I got my first job at 16, they barely acknowledged it. I remember coming home exhausted after a full shift at a local diner, smelling like burnt fries, and all my dad said was, "Hope you're saving for college." Meanwhile, when Melanie got a summer internship through one of her rich boyfriend's connections, my parents threw a whole celebratory dinner. I wasn't even invited. College was more the same. I had to work 2 jobs, take on student loans, and skip vacations just to afford tuition. My parents never offered to help. Melanie, on the other hand, fully funded education, no questions asked. She changed majors 3 times, took a self-care semester off, and somehow still graduated debt-free. When I brought this up, my mom gave me the classic. "You're the older one. We knew you could handle it." Right, because struggling builds character, just not for Melanie. Fast forward to now. I'm 25, working in IT, and doing well for myself. I have a solid salary, a decent apartment, tiny but at least it's mine, and a life that I built from scratch. My parents, on the other hand, haven't had the best luck. My dad lost his job recently, and my mom called me in tears, talking about how they didn't know how they were going to cover the mortgage and bills. I asked the obvious question, what about Melanie? Her husband is loaded. They live in a house with a gated driveway, a heated pool, and a guest house bigger than my entire apartment. Surely she could help out? My mom hesitated before giving me the most ridiculous excuse I'd ever heard. Melanie had too many expenses. Apparently, her high-maintenance lifestyle meant she couldn't possibly chip in. And besides, she didn't want to burden her husband with her family's financial troubles. I nearly laughed out loud at that one. Burden him? This guy drives a brand-new Porsche, wears watches that cost more than my annual rent. And just last month, they posted pictures from vacation in Bora Bora. But of course, my parents weren't about to push their precious princess. So, who did they turn to? The responsible one. The one who had worked for everything he had. And because I have a conscience, something that seems to have skipped over certain family members, I agreed to help. I started wiring them $2,500 every month. It wasn't spare change, but I figured I owed it to them. They were my parents. After all, at least that's what I told myself at the time. At first, sending my parents money felt good, like I was finally in a position to give back, to help them when they needed it. I wasn't rolling in cash, but I wasn't struggling either. It felt like the right thing to do. Like maybe, just maybe, they'd finally see me as a dependable son, the one they could be proud of. But that feeling didn't last long. It started subtly. My mom would mention how tight things were that month, how the bills were piling up, how my dad was still looking for the right opportunity. At first, I sent extra without thinking about it, but then it became a pattern. They never asked outright, never said, "Hey, can you send more money?" No, it was always little hints, casual, offhand remarks that made me feel like a terrible person if I didn't offer more. "Things have just been so stressful lately, Alex," my mom would say. "We're barely keeping up. It's just so hard to make ends meet." Or my dad would mention how the car needed some repairs and how expensive everything was getting. And I'd find myself pulling up my banking app, wiring over another few $100s before I even processed what I was doing. Meanwhile, Melanie was living it up. Her husband, Jason, had money, and not the worked hard and made smart investments kind. No, Jason had dad handed me the keys to the business money. His family owned some nationwide chain of car dealerships, and Jason was technically running the company. From what I could tell, that mostly meant golfing on weekdays and posting pictures of his watches on social media. And Melanie, she fit into that world perfectly. She had a personal trainer, a weekly spa appointment, and a closet that looked like a high-end boutique. Her biggest stress in life seemed to be deciding whether to redecorate their vacation home in Florida or upgrade to a newer model of luxury SUV. And yet, my parents still saw her as the one who had it all figured out. Melanie is just so smart with her life choices. My mom told me once, you should really take notes from her. Take notes? What was I supposed to be learning? That the key to success wasn't working hard, but marrying someone whose dad owned half the state? That's all Melanie had ever done. Latched onto someone with deep pockets and an easy life. And yet, my parents spoke about her like she had cracked some kind of secret code for happiness and financial stability. It was infuriating. Meanwhile, I was living in a small apartment where the hot water ran out if I showered for more than 10 minutes. I was budgeting groceries, fixing my own car when something broke, and doing all the things responsible adults do. But none of that mattered. But, of course, I didn't say anything. Instead, I just kept wiring the money, kept nodding along when my mom would tell me how proud she was of Melanie's choices, how I should follow her example. Follow her example? Yeah, sure. Let me just go find a millionaire to bankroll my life. And that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was knowing that no matter how much I helped, no matter how much I sacrificed, I would never be their favorite. I would always be the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who didn't need praise or appreciation. And I was starting to realize just how exhausting that role really was. Birthdays were never a big deal in my family. At least, not for me. When Melanie turned 18, my parents rented out a fancy rooftop venue, invited half the town, and even got a professional photographer. My 18th, a store-bought cake and a happy birthday kid from my dad before he changed the channel. So I wasn't expecting much for my 26th. Still, I thought maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. I invited my parents over for dinner at my place. Nothing extravagant, just some homemade food, a couple of drinks, and actual quality time. I spent hours prepping. Even got a decent bottle of wine, not the usual $10 bottle I grabbed from the grocery store. It wasn't just about celebrating. I wanted to feel like family again, even if it was just for one evening. They declined. My mom said they weren't feeling well, some vague mention of headaches and exhaustion. My dad, in the background, coughed dramatically, like he was auditioning for a daytime soap opera. I told them to rest, that I'd check in on them later. 3 days passed. Then I got a call that changed everything. It was Mr. Carter, their neighbor. Nice guy, always looking out for the neighborhood. Retired. Spends most of his time tending to his lawn and casually knowing everyone's business. He started the conversation casually, asking how I was doing, then dropped this gem. Hey, just a heads up, I've been keeping an eye on your folks' place while they're out of town. There was a plumbing issue, but I got it taken care of. Figured you want to know in case they call you about it. I had to replay that in my head. Out of town? They were supposed to be home. Sick, barely able to get out of bed. Wait, what do you mean out of town? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Oh, yeah, they left a few days ago. Some trip with your sister and her husband. They must have forgotten to mention it. Anyway, just letting you know the plumbers fixed everything. Shouldn't be a problem now. I barely remember ending the call. My parents, who had turned down my birthday dinner because they were too sick, were actually on vacation with Melanie and Jason. And then it hit me. 3 days ago, the same day they supposedly couldn't even get out of bed, they had asked me for money, for medicine. Not groceries, not bills, medicine. I felt like an idiot. I had been so quick to help, so eager to be the responsible son, that I never even questioned it. I checked my bank transactions. There was $1, $500 wired straight to my mom, tagged emergency expenses. Guess the emergency was choosing between poolside cocktails and fancy resort massages. I sat there, phone in hand, running through every time they had ever guilt-tripped me into giving them money. Every time they said they were struggling. Every time they hinted at how hard life was while their golden child was off drinking overpriced coffee at some boutique cafe and debating which luxury handbag spoke to her soul. I stare at my phone, debating whether to call them, confront them, demand an explanation. But deep down, I already knew what would happen. They'd play it off, say I was overreacting, maybe even twist it, so I felt guilty for checking up on them. And I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. For days, I stewed in my own anger. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected another message from my mom, casually updating me on her recovery. Sure enough, by the end of the week, my parents called to say they were feeling much better. My mom even added a little extra. We just needed some rest, that's all. I could feel my blood pressure rising. They had no idea I knew the truth. No idea that their rest had been a beachside resort vacation. No idea that Mr. Carter had unknowingly exposed their entire lie with one phone call. But I forced myself to stay calm. If I confronted them over the phone, I knew how it would go. They'd deflect, play the victim, twist the story until I ended up apologizing for even bringing it up. No, this needed to happen in person. So I waited. I let them get comfortable, let them come home, settle back into their routine, and believe their deception had worked. And then I drove over. When my mom answered the door, she looked surprised, but not in a happy-to-see-you way. More like a, why are you here unannounced? Way. I didn't waste time. How was the trip? The color drained from her face. So fast, I almost felt bad. Almost. She tried to play dumb. Trip? What trip? I just stared at her. No expression. No reaction. Just waited. The silence stretched, and she started fidgeting with the bracelet on her wrist. A dead giveaway. Then she went for the defensive move. We're not obligated to report our every move to you, Alex. I laughed. Actually laughed. Right. But you're fine with asking me for money while conveniently leaving out the part where you're flying off for vacation? She opened her mouth, but I wasn't done. You told me you needed help for medical expenses. You played it up like you were sick, like Dad could barely get out of bed. Meanwhile, you were probably sipping cocktails by the pool while I was wiring you money. Her eyes darted toward my dad, who had come into the room, arms crossed. He must have sensed things were getting out of hand because he jumped in. Don't raise your voice at your mother. I wasn't yelling, but I sure as hell wasn't backing down. I'm not raising my voice. I'm just done playing along. Done being the reliable son, while Melanie and Jason get to live like royalty without lifting a finger. If they're so much smarter with their choices, maybe they should be the ones supporting you. My mom sputtered something about how I was twisting things, but I didn't care anymore. I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and with a few taps, canceled the automatic transfers I had been sending them every month. There. Now you can ask Melanie and Jason for money. See how that works out for you. I didn't wait for a response. I turned, walked out the door, and didn't look back. As I got into my car, my phone vibrated. A message from Melanie popped up. Mom is crying. What did you do? I stared at the screen, shaking my head. Of course. Not, why were they lying to you? Not, I'm sorry for the way they treated you. Just immediate blame. Classic. I took a deep breath, tossed my phone onto the passenger seat, and pulled out the driveway. If they wanted someone else to fund their lifestyle, they could go ahead and ask their golden child. The next morning, my phone started buzzing before I even had a chance to make coffee. I groaned, rubbing my eyes, already knowing who it was. Sure enough, Mom lit up the screen. Then Dad. Then Melanie. Back-to-back calls, like they had some emergency family meeting about how to handle their ungrateful son. I let it ring. They could wait. But, of course, they didn't. A few minutes later, a text popped up from my mom. Can you at least talk to us? We don't understand why you're acting this way. Acting this way? I stared at my phone, shaking my head. Another message came through, this time from my dad. Is this about the vacation? Are you mad we didn't invite you? I laughed out loud. Actually laughed. The level of delusion was incredible. I took a sip of my now cold coffee and finally typed back, I was working while you were on vacation with Melanie and Jason. But no, this isn't about the money. It's about respect. No response. A few hours passed before my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my mom calling. Against my better judgment, I answered. Alex, honey, we're your parents. It's your responsibility to help us. That's what family does. Responsibility. Right. The same responsibility that apparently didn't apply to Melanie because she had other priorities. The same responsibility that meant they could guilt trip me into paying their bills while they sipped margaritas at a resort. You're making a mistake, Alex. You're letting money come between us. That was rich. I didn't say anything, just exhaled sharply. Then, before she could start another round of guilt tripping, I hung up. The calls didn't stop. For the rest of the day, my phone was a war zone. Voicemails from my dad about family duty. Texts from Melanie saying I was being dramatic. Even Jason threw in a comment, which was hilarious considering I had never heard the guy talk about anything other than golf and networking. At one point, Melanie left me a voice message. You're just jealous, Alex. Admit it. You can't stand that I have a better life than you. That one got a good laugh out of me. I played it on speaker just so Stephanie, my girlfriend, could hear it too. She rolled her eyes and muttered, classic. By mid-afternoon, I had turned off my phone notifications. I didn't need this circus ruining my entire day. Instead, I cleaned up my apartment, something I actually enjoyed doing when I wasn't drowning in stress. I took my time, made a real breakfast for once, and even went out for a walk. It was the most peaceful day I'd had in a long time. Later that evening, Stephanie came over. She took one look at my phone vibrating nonstop on the table and let out a low whistle. Without saying a word, she dropped her bag, made herself comfortable next to me, and casually picked up the remote, flipping through the channels like she had seen this all before. It was just another night in the saga of Alex versus his family. Then, finally, she glanced over and smirked. About time. I exhaled. For the first time in days, I actually felt lighter. The next day, I made a decision. No more picking up the phone. Stephanie and I had planned a quiet morning, just the two of us, making breakfast together and finally watching that movie we kept putting off. She was flipping pancakes while I made coffee, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was no stress, no distractions. Just us, the smell of fresh bacon in the air, and a lazy day ahead. No more explaining myself. No more getting dragged into pointless arguments about family duty. I put my phone on silent, tossed it onto the couch, and went about my day. We sat down at the kitchen table, plates full, ready to finally enjoy a meal in peace. No rush bites in between emails. No text guilt tripping me before I even had my coffee. It felt almost surreal to have a quiet moment, just the two of us, before the world intruded again. Then came the knocking. It wasn't casual, hey, just dropping by kind of knock. It was firm, insistent, the kind of knock that said, we know you're in there. I sighed, ran a hand through my hair, and went to open the door. And there they were. Melanie stood front and center, dressed like she was about to walk into a high-stakes boardroom meeting. Tailored blazer, designer heels, sunglasses, even though it wasn't remotely sunny. She held her bag tight, like this was a business transaction she was about to close. Behind her, my parents. My mom's arms were crossed, her face set in that disappointed expression she had mastered over the years. My dad stood stiffly, his jaw clenched like he was preparing for battle. I leaned against the doorframe, unimpressed. Melanie, Mom, Dad, to what do I owe the pleasure? Melanie didn't waste time. This is getting ridiculous. Alex, just turn the transfers back on. It's not a big deal. I let out a short laugh. Not a big deal? If it's not a big deal, why are you standing on my doorstep like the cast of an intervention show? Her lips pressed into a thin line. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. I crossed my arms. If you're so worried about it, you're more than welcome to cover their expenses. Melanie scoffed, shifting her weight onto one hip. That's not the point. You've always helped them. Why stop now? I gestured between her and our parents. Because I finally realized something. If they need money so badly, that's your problem now. You're their favorite, right? Time to live up to the title. That's when my dad decided to chime in. We don't need your handouts, Alex. We need you to do what's right. You have a responsibility to your family. It's not about money, it's about respect. I exhaled through my nose, willing myself to stay calm. Good, because you won't be getting any more of my handouts. Mom's face tightened. After everything we've done for you, you wouldn't have made it this far without us. You think you're successful on your own? You owe us. I felt my jaw clench. There it was. The classic, without us, you're nothing argument. The one they'd use for years to keep me in check. But this time, it didn't hit the same way. This time, I wasn't buying it. Melanie rolled her eyes. Oh, come on, Alex. You're acting like we drained your entire bank account. You make good money. You could turn the payments back on, and it wouldn't even affect you. I narrowed my eyes. That's exactly the problem. You all think just because I can help, I should. Meanwhile, Melanie's out here living a luxury lifestyle without ever being asked to contribute. My dad took a step forward, his voice dropping into that low, authoritative tone he always used when he wanted to shut down an argument. You're being selfish. This isn't how family treats each other. I tilted my head. Funny, I was thinking the same thing. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. My mom shifted uncomfortably, like she was debating between doubling down and trying to soften the conversation. But before she could speak, my dad delivered the final blow. Without us, you'll never make it. You think you're successful? You think you don't need us? You'll fail, Alex. And when you do, don't come crawling back. I didn't flinch, didn't react. Just let his words hang in the air for a moment before finally answering, my voice calm, steady. Good, because I wasn't planning on it. Silence. Even Melanie looked surprised. I took a step back, expecting them to finally get the message. But instead of leaving, Melanie's expression twisted into something uglier. She threw up her hands, gesturing wildly, her voice rising. You know what? You're pathetic, Alex. You act like you're so much better than us, but you're just a bitter little failure. You'll never be anything without us. Melanie jabbed a finger at my chest. You think you're some self-made success story? Newsflash, you're a nobody. Always have been, always will be, and when your little independence act falls apart, don't bother calling us. Just as I moved to shut the door, Melanie let out a sharp, mocking laugh. You really think you're a good guy here? You walked away from your own family. I barely had time to react before she shoved her foot forward, jamming it between the door and the frame. My grip tightened on the doorknob. Move your foot, Melanie. She didn't budge. If anything, she leaned in, tilting her head like she was genuinely amused. You think this is over? Family doesn't work that way. You don't just get to cut us off and pretend we don't exist. I sighed, already tired of this conversation. That's funny, because I could have sworn you all did that to me a long time ago. Before Melanie could spit out another comeback, I felt movement behind me. Stephanie, who had been silent through this whole ridiculous scene, stepped forward. She wasn't angry, wasn't even raising her voice. She just had that presence, the kind that made people shut up and listen. Without hesitation, she placed both hands firmly on Melanie's shoulders and, with an impressive amount of force, pushed her backward, stepping into the doorway. You need to leave. Now. Melanie stumbled, eyes wide, completely thrown off. Did you just... Go, Stephanie said, her voice cool and steady. For a second, Melanie looked ready to lose it completely. Her perfectly manicured fingers clenched into fists, her face turning red. But then something shifted. Maybe it was a realization that, for the first time, someone was standing up to her. Maybe it was the way Stephanie wasn't backing down, her stare steady, unshaken. Either way, Melanie hesitated. Behind her, my parents stood frozen. My mom's mouth opened slightly like she wanted to protest, but no words came out. My dad? Arms crossed, jaw clenched, his usual I'm in control demeanor slipping. They weren't used to being told no. Melanie took a shaky step back, but the fight wasn't over yet. Her lips curled into a sneer. This isn't over. You think you can just do this to me? You think I'm going to let you get away with this? She spun on her heels so fast I half expected her to twist an ankle in those ridiculous designer heels. My mom shot me one last look, some mix of disappointment and resentment, before reluctantly following her. My dad lingered for half a second longer, then shook his head like I was the one being unreasonable and walked off. I waited until I heard their car door slam before I turned back inside, locking the door behind me. Stephanie leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching me. That was fun. I let out a dry laugh. Yeah, a real bonding experience. She tilted her head toward the door. She's going to come back, you know. I sighed, rubbing a hand down my face. Yeah, I know. And something told me next time it was going to be worse. A few hours had passed since Melanie's dramatic exit, and for the first time all day, the apartment felt peaceful. Stephanie and I had finally settled onto the couch, a bowl of popcorn between us. Half watching some action movie neither of us was really paying attention to. The kind of night that should have been easy. Then came the knocking. Heavy, loud, a little too aggressive to be a neighbor. I groaned, tossing a piece of popcorn into my mouth. You've got to be kidding me. Stephanie exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. They don't quit, do they? Who's next? Melanie's lawyer. A priest? Some guy in a bad suit telling us we want a free cruise. I got up and made my way to the door, expecting to see Melanie standing there with a whole new round of insults. But when I opened it, it wasn't her. It was Jason. Unlike Melanie's polished, calculated presence, Jason looked downright furious. His expensive button-up was wrinkled, his face was red, and he had the unmistakable energy of a guy who had just been hyped up by his wife to go handle it. Before I could say a word, he stepped inside, pushing past me like he owned the place. We need to talk, he barked. His eyes weren't even on me. He was staring directly at Stephanie. She raised an eyebrow, casually reaching for another handful of popcorn. I don't think we do. Jason jabbed a finger in her direction. She needs to learn some respect. I was already moving before my brain fully processed it. Muscle memory kicked in. A throwback to the Aikido classes I took back in high school. One quick motion, one well-placed shift of weight, and before Jason even knew what was happening, he was on the floor. Hard. He blinked up at me, completely stunned. What the? Stephanie snorted. Wow, that was fast. Jason groaned, rubbing his shoulder, still trying to process how he had gone from storming like a tough guy to lying flat on my floor. He let out a weak chuckle. All right, man, maybe I came a little hot. I crossed my arms. Yeah, maybe. Jason started to push himself up, but I stepped forward, my voice calm but firm. Too late for that now. You're leaving. He hesitated, like he wanted to argue, but the reality of the situation seemed to sink in. He scrambled to his feet, dusting himself off, and shot me a glare. This isn't over. I sighed, shaking my head. Yeah, I've heard that one before. Jason backed toward the door, pointing at me as he went. You're going to regret this. You both will. Stephanie, completely unfazed, leaned against the couch. Do we get to guess who's next? Because so far, this has been hilarious. Jason clenched his jaw, spun on his heel, and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I turned to Stephanie, letting out a slow breath. Well, that was fun. She grinned, tossing another piece of popcorn into her mouth. I swear, at this rate, they're going to send a whole army before they finally take the hint. I laughed, but something in the back of my mind told me Jason wasn't done just yet. And that thought, that was the only thing keeping me from fully relaxing. A few days had passed since Jason's little stunt, and for the first time in a while, things were quiet. Too quiet. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing, or if it meant they were plotting their next move. Either way, I wasn't about to let my guard down. Then my phone buzzed. It was Mr. Carter, my parents' neighbor. Hey, Alex, I don't mean to get in your business, but I figured you want to know. Last night, your folks were yelling so loud the whole street could hear. My grandson recorded some of it. I can send it over if you want. I hesitated for a second before replying. Send it. A few seconds later, the video came through. The camera was shaky, probably recorded from a bedroom window, but the audio was crystal clear. Melanie's voice cut through first, sharp and full of fury. You think this is funny? You think this is my problem now? This is your fault. You should have just kept your mouth shut. Now I have to be the one supporting you. Then my mother, we didn't do anything wrong. He's the one who turned his back on us. My dad's voice was more rigid, but just as bitter. We don't need his handouts. We're better off without him. Melanie wasn't having it. Oh, really? You're better off? Then where's your money coming from? What's the plan, Dad? You just gonna sit around and hope the bills pay themselves? There was a long silence before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice was lower, but just as sharp. You just want someone to leech off. That's what this is. You don't care about me. You just care about what I can do for you. My mom let out something that sounded halfway between a gasp and a scoff. How dare you talk to us like that? We raised you. We sacrificed for you. Melanie's laugh was dry, humorless. Yeah, and now you're out of people to take advantage of. Good luck with that. The screen blurred as the camera shifted, but the last thing I heard was Jason's voice, low and firm. We have our own family to take care of. Don't call us again. Then the video ended. I sat there for a moment, just staring at the screen. Stephanie, who had been reading beside me, glanced over. Well, that escalated quickly. I let out a breath, shaking my head. Melanie finally figured it out. Took her long enough. Stephanie smirked. So what now? You gonna send them a fruit basket? Maybe a congratulations on ruining every relationship you ever had card. I chuckled, but the weight of it all still sat heavy. My parents had spent years choosing Melanie over me, and in the end, she left them behind the second they became a burden. For the first time in their lives, they had no one left to lean on, and they had no one to blame but themselves. Life was peaceful. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't waking up to missed calls, guilt-tripping texts, or unexpected visits from people who felt entitled to my time, energy, and bank account. Stephanie and I had moved into a bigger apartment, one with an actual view instead of a parking lot. It had a kitchen big enough for both of us to cook in without stepping on each other's toes, a balcony where we could drink coffee in the mornings, and a couch that didn't feel like it was stuffed with bricks. It was ours, and it finally felt like home. Work was going better than ever. I had recently been promoted to department head, which meant more money, better hours, and a whole lot less stress. No more answering to people who didn't know what they were doing. No more scrambling to cover for others. Just me, finally getting the recognition I had earned. We started making plans for the future. Real plans. A trip we actually wanted to take. Maybe even buying a house someday. For once, it felt like everything was moving in the right direction. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed. A number I hadn't seen in months. This is Dad. Call me. It's urgent. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, debating whether to ignore it. Maybe I should have, but curiosity got the better of me, so I hit dial. My dad picked up on the first ring. No pleasantries, no fake warmth. He got straight to the point. This isn't about money. It's about Melanie. She's getting divorced. I blinked, and Jason kicked her out. She has nothing. She's back here with us. I waited for the part where this became my problem. When I didn't say anything, he added, "She wants to talk to you." I almost laughed. Almost. Let me get this straight, I said, leaning back into the couch. The same sister who spent years treating me like an afterthought? Who called me a failure? Who told me I'd regret cutting you off? That Melanie? Now she needs my help. There was silence on the other end. Then, finally, my dad exhaled sharply. She's in a bad place, Alex. I smirked, shaking my head. Not my problem. Stephanie, who had been sitting beside me the whole time, arched an eyebrow. Let me guess. Now you're supposed to be the family savior again. I put my phone down and let out a dry chuckle. Apparently. She snorted. So what's the plan? You gonna send her a thoughts and prayers card? Maybe a Hope this teaches you a lesson, fruit basket. I laughed, shaking my head. Nope. I think hanging up was enough. For the first time in my life, I was truly free.